Evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants have an interesting way of talking about salvation in which they will emphasize the sovereignty of God's grace, but in a way that ironically undermines that very grace. Because on the framework, the way that they talk about salvation, any failure to acknowledge God's grace undermines that very grace, which makes that grace itself flimsy, unreliable, which cultivates new fear within the Christian. So, for example, look at this tweet from this fellow Danny. He says, "You either believe that Christ accomplished absolutely everything necessary for salvation, or you are trusting in yourself. Those are your binary options. Either you completely depend upon God's grace in Christ, or you are completely lost on your own, trusting in yourself." So that he says 99% grace plus 1% works equals works. And works won't get you to heaven, it won't get you saved. What that ends up doing then is that any error in orthodoxy or orthopraxis, any failure to acknowledge fully and all the time God's absolute sovereignty and grace undermines the very salvation that you are professing. It's ironic that it has the exact opposite effect of what it's supposed to do. Rather than to maximize your confidence and peace in salvation in Christ alone, it cultivates a practical fear about that 1% of works, that any degree to which you are failing to acknowledge fully God's complete sovereignty in salvation. Here's another interesting example of the same phenomenon. You may have heard this expression: Jesus plus anything equals nothing. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Again, the idea here, well intentioned, is to emphasize the absolute sovereignty of God's grace and the supremacy of Christ in salvation, that you are not saved by works, but by grace. And this is supposed to relieve that burden from you because his yoke is easy and his burden is light. But ironically, what that ends up often doing is saying, so to the degree that you are adding anything to salvation, that equals nothing. The result is nothing. It negates, it evacuates salvation, which places you in a perilous soteriological position. In other words, you are left uncertain then of your salvation, constantly questioning whether you have added anything. Now, interestingly, Martin Luther himself is most famously associated with the idea of the sovereignty of God's grace. And Luther himself, even long after his quote unquote tower experience, where he came to have this new deepened understanding of the absolute sovereignty of God's grace, he continued himself to worry about his own potential damnation, that he was not one of the elect. I'm not saying that what Luther experienced in terms of his own questioning of his salvation throughout his life as a Protestant is the same thing exactly as what we're talking about here, but I do think there is at least a family resemblance. And so the irony here is that when you have these simplistic understandings of salvation, it can imperil the salvation of people, ironically, because any failure, any deviation from the proper orthodox recognition of the supremacy of Christ alone in salvation undermines your salvation and therefore can seem to make it even more tenuous than ever.